committed to a group that was essentially a way for Keith to maintain loyalty and keep women in and keep them in forever, because the idea was it was a vow of obedience. And what it ended up being was not a badass boot camp for women to hold each other accountable, but basically a blackmail pyramid scheme for Keith to have a harem of women and eventually brand them. I grew up in Vancouver, Canada. I was a total nerd growing up. I was a theater kid in high school, and I had big red glasses and braces, and I really struggled to fit in. I was always looking for belonging. That's probably where it all started. I was 26, about to turn 27. I was introduced by a filmmaker on a cruise, and the cruise was called the Spiritual Cinema Circle Festival at Sea. I know that's a mouthful. And I was with a bunch of other spiritual filmmakers, and I was really excited because I thought I loved my acting career, but it wasn't as meaningful and purposeful as I was hoping it was going to be. I've always been a seeker and into personal development and read a ton of books on how to improve. And when I met Mark Vicente, who's a filmmaker, I was like, I loved your film. I want to do what you're doing. And he's like, oh, cool. Well, there's this program that I just took that you might like too. And that was the beginning of it. The first few days were terrible. I had so many red flags going off, things that if I had known then what I know now, I would have left immediately. But I had committed to getting my money's worth and giving it a shot. And I'd also been preempted that things were going to be weird. I'd been preempted that I would feel uncomfortable, and that means that I had issues to work on. And imagine going to therapy for like 12 straight hours for 5 days. So I had a lot of things untangled. So by the end of those 5 days, I thought, this is amazing. I'm going to tell all my friends. And I sure did. I'd been there for 11 and a half years. I didn't really realize it, but I was checked out. I was more focused on my kid. I was not happy with a lot of things in the company. And I think the leadership knew that. So when they brought me in, it was really pitched to me as something that sounded like the final thing that I needed for my growth. And they reeled me back in with a promise of something that sounded great. There's a lot of things that led up to that moment, a lot of indoctrination and part of the system of NXIVM that made the things that happened palpable for me to say yes to certain things. So for example, there was collateral. Collateral had been going on in NXIVM for about 4 or 5 years before this, where people would put down collateral as a weight to their word, just like, collateral is used in a bank. But what collateral actually was used as blackmail. People were giving things that would be used against them to, first of all, commit to secrecy. So I committed to joining the secret club, couldn't even tell my husband, couldn't tell anyone else. I wouldn't even know who else was in the club until later on. People who trusted me enough, because really it was built on trust, they would come and take the training. And for the most part, they got their money's worth. It was really just problematic for the people who continued on in the program, who dedicated their life or devoted their life to the curriculum or to the company, or who moved to upstate New York to be closer to the leadership. That's where things got bad. If it was what they promised it would have been great. But of course, it was a lie, and it was a method to get people hooked in to an illusion of hope, giving people the belief that if they got to the top, they'd achieve something that was actually impossible. Very complicated to explain, but I committed to a group that was essentially a way for Keith to maintain loyalty and keep women in and keep them in forever, because the idea was it was a vow of obedience. And what it ended up being was not a badass boot camp for women to hold each other accountable, but basically a blackmail pyramid scheme for Keith to have a harem of women and eventually brand them, figuring out later that the symbol on my body was not a symbol for the elements, which I'd been told, but his initials in a cryptic monogram. And that's what ultimately, snapped me out of the Kool-Aid. A lot of the personal development space and people who want to grow, even in business, there's an assumption right at the beginning of like, you're a broken bird, or there's something wrong with you, and so you need this. It's built on an assumption of neediness, and a lot of sales, unfortunately, has that component to it. That's a red flag for me. If there's an environment where you feel like you can't question, you can't have any contrary opinion, everyone's thinking the same thing. If you feel like you can't leave, if you're going to leave and you're going to be shunned or excommunicated or like cut out, or not, people won't speak to you in some way, that's a big red flag. In the 4 years since writing the book, I have healed so much more. And I'd say this is mostly from the vow and now the podcast, but people reach out pretty much daily saying, I didn't realize how toxic it was till I saw the vow. I've now left and I have my life back and I can't thank you enough. And that type of affirmation of that, we're doing the right thing, and that those types of letters and knowing that we've helped people in that way is probably the most rewarding thing. I actually really do love working on A Little Bit Culty with Nippy, because I feel like the values that drew us together initially are still what we get to do together. And I think that's something that I've learned along the way, that a good relationship is really when those values line up. We don't necessarily have to do everything together. He doesn't have to come to yoga with me. I don't go to the gym with him. But when we come together to do A Little Bit Culty, we have a very clear mission. Some people who heard my TED Talk said it was like the best of album of the podcast, which is also what I'm propelling into the book. You don't need a guru. You don't need essential oil starter kit to be a better you. You might want some cult tips, but really you don't need anything because you're whole and complete. That was my nugget. I think I'm most proud of putting aside any concern of what people might think about me to be vulnerable and show my humanness and get out of a very hard situation and then show people that they can do the same.